All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm very excited to be hosting this amazing webinar in another session of Inside the Matrix with my good friend Ilya from Quokka. Um, so thank you everybody for coming out. We have a full house with a lot of folks in here. And today we're going to be talking about the exciting world of mobile device management and mobile device security. Before we dive right in, a little bit of just general housekeeping, folks. The Q&A component of the webinar is turned on. Along the way, if you have any questions at all and you would like to just jump right in, hit create a post, hammer in your question, Ilya and I will be able to see that and we can help address that. This webinar is hosted without audio and video for attendees. So Q&A is the only way that you're going to be able to interact with us. Okay. With that, Ilya, everyone is dying to hear from you and your amazing introduction. I know you've got an extremely interesting background and a fantastic company called Quokka. So do share with us.
Sure. Nim, first of all, thank you for having me here. So a little bit about my background and a lot about Quokka. I started out as a developer. I was working on some fairly archaic systems, and then I decided to come out of the basement and start talking to people. It's a funny story, but I mean it quite literally. My first job as a developer, I actually was in a basement. So I started working with customers. I started looking at how developers use tools, how security uses tools. And so for the last, 15, 20 years, I've really been working with developers on creating more secure products. And I went from, back-end systems and embedded devices all the way through to mobile apps. I've been doing mobile pretty exclusively for the last 8 years or so. And I joined Quokka about 3 years ago. So Quokka, we started out as CryptoWire, actually, was the name of the company back in 2011. Started with some funding out of the US government, out of DARPA, and started researching, what are the threats in what at the time was a brand new world. We had the iPhone 1, we had this Play Store, we had the App Store for Apple. And so, the government, it started with the government in the US. They wanted to understand what are the unique risks posed by mobile devices and these mobile app stores and mobile apps. And so over the years, we've, worked on creating a lot of technology to identify and later protect from some of those risks. This was a company that first discovered that TikTok was sending data to China back in 2018. Sort of got on the map for finding that, but fast forward 6 or 7 years, that's old news. We're looking at discovering all sorts of 0 days, understanding and discovering threats on mobile that are very unique. And I saw just some things in the news that you and I can talk about, some things that are very relevant to this. But I think mobile is a somewhat misunderstood ecosystem because people are very comfortable with how a computer works and they figure mobile must be just a mobile computer, and it's not. And so that's some of the interesting things that we've been researching over the last few years, and I'd love to tell you more about it.
That's awesome, dude. I know you mentioned iPhone 1. So here's a
Yeah.
collection of the first three generations of iPhones that were released.
Very
From
nice.
iPhone 1 with a little square on the button all the way up. So, we all have a collection of
Amazing.
these devices, and fact
That's right.
is nowadays you can't conduct business without them. So let's everyone just, here's a fun game. I know we can't be too interactive, but let's talk about this. How many mobile device subscriptions are active in the world right now? Subscription meaning a cell phone plan, pay as you go or prepaid that is connected to a phone. That number is 8.5 billion. B for
That's
Bravo,
right.
billion. Who knows how many people are on Earth that are capable of holding a phone from 0 days old to 95, 105, 125 years old. There's 8.2 billion people on the planet. So that comes down to at least one device per person. But in reality, it's more than one device per person because, ideally 6-month-olds aren't walking around with a phone on their hands yet.
Not yet.
Um, but phones have become the computing platform of choice for conducting business. Interesting statistic that we look at, for example, on our system, when we look at leads coming in from our website or any collaboration we have with people who don't know about our brand on LinkedIn or social media and website, guess what? 90% of those contacts are coming via mobile device, Android or iPhone. Occasionally you see a BlackBerry out there, but it also registers as an Android now, but that's kind
That's
of how it
right.
works. um, Another fun stat. Let's talk a little bit about some of research done by our friends from IDC. So between 2020 and 2023 December, um, they were able to do a study on how much mobile device or how often mobile devices were attacked globally. What do you think that number looks like, folks? Think about a number in your head, and I'll promise you it's wrong. There was 5 billion various mobile device attacks happening at various times between 2020 to 2023, all targeting the mobile device. And which just indicates to us that the threat plane is real. And we have to pay extra attention as we start embracing more and more mobile functionality in our day-to-day lives, as well as our business, on how to do a better job protecting this.
Yeah.
So we're gonna talk a little bit about a few things today, starting with gaps in the traditional MDM system. So we all heard Intune. There's so many other ones, but they do a great job protecting the device itself as an appliance. But Ilya, let's talk about a little bit on why it matters to consider app level security. And I know you have a great analogy you shared with me before. Maybe we should share that with the broader team as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when you look at protecting a device, a laptop, a computer, think about the type of threat vectors that exist. It's got one giant storage array, right? All your files are there, pictures, documents, everything, right? And all the processes are running on it, and you have a direct, web and web portal, right? Web app, or a website that you go to interact. And so you're really focused on protecting the device. And if there is in an enterprise setting, right, if there is a threat detected on an endpoint, what do? Well, you disconnect it from the network, then you do some forensics, then, you upgrade the operating system or you patch it or what have you. But a mobile phone, you can't exactly disconnect an employee's mobile phone from the network, right? Then it doesn't do anything.
Nope.
So when you think about mobile, iOS and Android specifically, everything is in the app, right? So the app itself becomes the endpoint because every app on your phone has its own permission system. It's got its own storage that's not necessarily shared with the other apps, and there are exceptions, which is important. It's got its own security policy. And the other thing that it doesn't have that I think we're all used to is, when you access a website on a web browser, you have the little lock icon that tells you that, everything is encrypted. But when you're using a mobile app, you have no idea if every connection point is actually properly encrypted. So you might have a banking app and it could have unencrypted communications. You'd never know, right?
Mhm.
So protecting a mobile device is not the same as you said, Nim. Protecting a mobile device is different than protecting the endpoint. You really need to focus on the apps as the endpoints.
So there could be scenarios where it's like almost like a man in the middle, but this time it's now between the application interface and the end destination that the application is communicating to, and that might be the weakest link within this communication chain, right?
Yeah, that's right. And if you like, I mean, we can look at a couple of very specific examples of categories of these types of risks because I think that's where the risk is. It's the apps are the endpoints. In fact, if
Yeah.
I share my screen here just for a couple seconds, really apps are the new endpoints. And the reason we say that is because these apps are not really uniform. There are certainly overprivileged apps which basically ask for too many permissions and it allows them to do things, but that's in the control of the user. So we can come back to that one. But there are leaky apps which are just leaking your PII, right? Your credentials or information that could be used against you. There are harvester apps like TikTok, but plenty of other apps that only exist really to slurp up as much data as you're willingly sharing with them. But the thing that we find really interesting in this list are the colluding apps, because as I said earlier, every app has its own data store, it really shouldn't share that with others. But if you think about it on a mobile phone, pictures reside in a central location where any app can say, "Hey, can I have access to the pictures?" Right?
Mm-hmm.
Files, documents you download are part of that as well, and apps talk to each other. And this was the most interesting thing that we found over the years, even going all the way back to 2018 when we saw TikTok doing this at the time. Apps can talk to other apps and essentially silently get permission to do things. So you might have one app and you say, "Yes, I grant you permission to my pictures," and it makes perfect sense. But what you might not realize is a different app can actually piggyback on that first app and also get access to your pictures and do something, much worse with them, as an
Mm-hmm.
example. And as a user, you're not notified that that other app is also getting that permission. And this is this concept of app collusion that we're
Mm-hmm.
looking at. And the other thing we see on these endpoints is, on a desktop, you're talking about an antivirus. It's looking for viruses that stay on the system and give people kind of access to the system over time. Nobody was really doing that on the mobile device, but there are these sticky apps which remain in memory, and they actually sort of function in a similar way, right? They kind of launch whenever you turn on your phone and do things in the background that you don't know about. But remember, all of these apps, they should be secured, right? They're coming from an app store. So
Mm-hmm.
so getting back to that discussion, I think, there really is a difference between securing the device. Like you said, MDM does a great job of locking down the device. You can have a list of, apps that you're not allowed to install. So, DeepSeek, comes out and everybody's freaking out about that, even though actually it's a pretty secure app. But, by the nature of what that app does, it literally takes everything you type in and sends it to China. Like we know that's what it's
Yeah.
doing. That's what it's designed to do, and it does it. And there's other apps that do that. So my point is securing the device and securing getting a VPN, for example, to encrypt your traffic. Like those are good ideas. Those are table stakes at this point, but they don't protect you from the unique app risks. And that's what,
Mm-hmm.
we really focus on.
And it matters because I mean we've got a lot of folks joining us in this webinar from the banking industry, insurance industry. We have a few folks from health, critical infrastructure, mobility, telecommunications. So these are all, in my mind, critical infrastructure anyway, because if you can get in through or exfiltrate data in a banking application, a mobile application for health, or your insurance application platform, all of this leads to some form of PII being breached or given access to information to go for the bad actor to go and get something else out of it. And you pointed out something interesting, and just as a general PSA, what people forget is there's a lot of configurable options in our devices, and we trust that the manufacturer default settings is doing the right thing. But when I look at my phone, I'm thinking there's no reason for Twitter or X to have access to my microphone, or Alexa to have access to my microphone in my phone. So that's on us as consumers to be security aware and making sure these components are turned off or disabled if we in fact don't need them, and turn them on a need to basis. So just personally, for
Yes.
example, my LinkedIn app doesn't have access to my photos all the time. It only has access to photos that I specifically allow it to share. That's a choice that I make. So these are settings available to everybody. But in this conversation, we're talking about mobile device protection and application security. We're going one step further. So we're talking about being able to detect malicious behavior, anomalous behavior, and creating a zero trust environment, especially if you are in the business of using that mobile app as a critical application for your business. Nurse network dispatch, scheduling application, insurance adjudication, gathering information at a collision site or a collision center and uploading that information specific to a certain activity that happened. Law enforcement. These are all specific cases. So let's talk a little bit about, Ilya, the importance of behavioral-based detection and facilitating sort of that zero trust functionality within this capability.
Yeah, absolutely. You've touched on three separate things that I think are important. The first one is obviously the permissions thing, right? We all are taught to minimize the permissions you give to these apps, and hey, does this app really need access to your calendar and why, and maybe turn it off. But how often do you pull up the list of all the permissions you've granted to all your apps and do a little bit of an inventory, right? You do that every day, every week? No, right? No
I
one
don't.
does. Yeah, so that's one of the problems is it's too easy to set and forget. In fact, there is one picture that I think is worth 1,000 words with these apps. Not this one, it's actually this one. So you touched on, it's you mentioned 8 billion devices in the world, right? I think these numbers are a little outdated, but the point is that's the devices. And the other number that's super important is there's about 80 apps on average on each phone. It varies, but it's not one, right? No one has a phone with exactly one app on it. So there's all these apps. And those apps, we just said earlier, are the endpoints, but those apps are talking to each other. So now there's these combinations of potential problems. So when you think of zero trust, you're not just trusting each app individually. You're saying, okay, but how do they interact? But the other key thing is the updates. So when you install the app, it says, hey, can I have permission to your calendar? And you say, sure, because it's a calendar app. And you don't remember that, right? So a week later, the app updates. A month later, the app updates. Every time the app updates, there could be new functionality that's suddenly going to use that permission in a bad way, but you don't get re-prompted every time like, hey, do you remember that you gave me calendar access? Well, now I'm actually going to slurp it up and send it to somewhere. Like we
Yeah.
don't, it doesn't happen like that, right? So that's the thing. So when you talk about zero trust, we break it down into zero trust. People apply that to mean, your credentials or did you log in for every transaction, sort of validating the user. But if the apps are leaking like a sieve, that's not zero trust, right? Even if you log in. So the zero trust really begins at the entry point, right? Where does the user interact with the app? What can it do? So when we look at the three types of risks, and I'll get to the behavior analysis at the end, as you mentioned, but the first one is just core risks, right? This is typical sort of security. You mentioned that there's a lot of attacks, a lot of breaches in mobile. I'm looking at a Verizon report that says 51% of folks in the enterprise banking, healthcare, right? They've experienced some kind of incident from an app like malware or, unpatched vulnerabilities. Well, the first category, core risks, that's unpatched vulnerabilities. That's hard-coded keys. That is not talking over a secure connection. That is, best practices around not leaking PII, that sort of thing, right? The second thing is what I talked about with these apps that can communicate to each other. And sometimes that's by design, right? If you have two different Microsoft apps and you log into your Microsoft account, you don't want to log in for every single app. So those apps are talking to each other. That's by design, that's normal. But then there's other times where, these apps have inter-app communication vulnerabilities is what we call them. And we have demos and all sorts of things I've seen over the years where you can get these apps to go and contact a different app and get data from it that you really shouldn't be able to, all silently, all without telling the user that this is happening, right? So these are real challenges around SBOM, big, right? Big in the military, big in the health sector, and the banking sector. Everybody's now required to provide an SBOM, which means a bill of materials, which basically means what are all the components inside each app and where did they come from, and how dangerous is each one. So that's on the app collusion. But the behavioral analysis is a really interesting bit, and let's talk about this for a minute. A mobile app can be vulnerable, but not malicious by design, right? So you can have an app where the developers made some mistakes that opens them up for vulnerability. Someone else comes along, figures that out, exploits the vulnerability. Now you have a problem. But the developers didn't intend to make the app malicious. And then you have apps where they're actually very secure, they're well coded, they don't have exploitable vulnerabilities, but they're malicious by design. So that's malware, right? And traditionally, antivirus on your computer, antivirus basically is a signature-based thing. It looks at known signatures. Like someone found out that this is malware, they reported it, the Play Store and the App Store took those apps down. Now we have a signature. So if somebody comes along and tries to use those same components, we can identify them. We know they're malicious.
Mhm.
But what about the period of time where the app was on the App Store and people were able to download and use it, but they didn't know that it was malicious?
Yep.
So this behavior analysis is something that we use to identify those zero-day risks, meaning we can identify that an app is behaving maliciously, even if it's clean from a coding point of view, even if there's no vulnerabilities to exploit, but the app is malicious. And sometimes the app is malicious by its design. And this is another topic to discuss. Maybe just stop sharing this for a second and we could talk about it. You mentioned these regulated industries like healthcare, banking, you know, transportation, logistics, air travel, right? They're all different and they all have different risk profiles. So think about a law firm versus a transportation company, and we say PII, right? So you say
Mm-hmm.
it has access to your pictures, for example. Okay, well, for a law firm, what does a typical lawyer have? What do they take pictures of? Contracts, documents, M&A contracts, right? That's even though it's PII in the sense like I don't want my pictures leaked on the internet. Okay, fine, but I'm an individual. But if you're an attorney, that presents a totally different risk profile. If you're in a say a services industry, you don't want your contracts leaked. If you're in some banking industry, that might not be a risk profile that you're very concerned about leaking pictures, right? But you might have a different concern about credentials or operations that should be protected. So again, it all points to the fact that mobile is different. Zero trust on a computer pretty much means you're authenticated into the network, you're a known entity, and when you use websites, it properly logs you in and asks for a second factor. But zero trust on a mobile app very much depends on what you're trying to protect and how it works. So some
Absolutely.
it's a little different.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Ilya, people also forget that security more so for mobile device than on your laptop or regular endpoints. But in general, security is always a status at a point in time, right? So I love that you said developers could, build the best possible app, and at the time that they built it, with the security capabilities available, they had created something that worked perfectly and was secure, and it was acceptable to cache information in your application because the user experience is better. If they're caching something in your app, it shows up faster, it paints faster on your screen, and you're a happy end user. But the reason I say it's point in time is because things like 0 days occur when the operating system changes. Apple, Android, whomever is developing a mobile operating system creates a new solution that was what was there before was great, but now because of what they changed, it creates a vulnerability into something that was working previously that isn't working the way it used to be. And this is where the weakness lies, that we actually don't have telemetry to detect and alert on these as quickly as we would like, which results in information being leaked. Even 2 days ago, Apple did two major CVE updates on zero-day vulnerabilities. Android is continuously doing these as well, up to us to download and install them. So given that you're really at the mercy of a point in time, how the developer built their app and what was working when they passed their security assessment at that time, an ever-changing security infrastructure of the operating system of the device. How do we keep track of, what our posture is? How do we sort of stay on top of this? What are some of our options?
Yeah, great question. And it separates out the app risks from the operating system risks or the ecosystem. So first and foremost, that is something MDM is really good at, which is enforce you can put in rules like the device operating system has to always be the latest version, right? So you have to update as soon as those, like you said, Apple patches, 0 days, the new version comes out. The MDM can tell the devices, you have to update. But for organizations that don't have an MDM, how do you enforce that? Um, Apple does a pretty good job when it sends out these patches. It kind of prompts people to update their phones, but of course, not everybody does. Android is even more interesting because there are actually two separate updates. There's the sort of vendor update. Say you have a Samsung phone, there's the Samsung UI, sort of usability updates. Then there's a separate monthly security patch level that comes in, and you could actually update one and have the phone tell you you're totally up to date, unless you know to look in a certain place that says, but your security updates haven't been updated in 3 months.
That's
Yeah,
right.
but it doesn't prompt you, so an MDM is a very good way to keep on top of that. Whereas for users that don't have an MDM implemented in their organization, that's actually a risk factor. And then there's the apps themselves, because the apps get updated by the users. And as new operating system features are rolled out, like you said, something that used to be not possible suddenly becomes possible, right? If you remember, Apple had an issue I want to say a couple of years ago, where you basically get the whole phone to reboot by just sending it Bluetooth keyboard commands continuously, which didn't used to be possible, but now it was in that particular instance
Yeah.
until they patched it. So, I mean, these things happen. And then there's the whole ecosystem, right? I mean, in Europe, Apple has to allow third-party app stores. So now you have apps coming in from different app stores, and each one has their own idea of security. And so, for Android, that's been a kind of a wider issue on an ongoing basis. But Apple is not really used to that, and Apple users are not used to that. And so there are implications, in the ecosystem level. There's implications in the operating system, and then the apps themselves.
That is so true. And I think it's a good time to talk about one um, misunderstanding, I'd say, in most end users' perspective. An MDM deployment and enrollment of your device is not a big brother function. And I think that's important for all of us as end users to understand. I've seen employees, contractors, vendors sort of balk at the fact that, even in our organization, when we say, hey, like, here's your, if you'd like to use mail on your phone, you have to go through a security enrollment process. And no, we can't read your personal information. We can't see your pictures. We can't edit or modify or store any data. We cannot wipe your phone, but we can wipe and control and manage our corporate information that is on that phone, right? We can remove the containerized version of Outlook, Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, and other sanctioned company apps. And if you're having a corporate phone, not BYOD, then there's a little bit more control on, what the enterprise can do. But again, it's not spyware. They're not able to use this. IT can't use it to go and read your mail and information like that. So I wanted to level set that, because a lot of people show up with questions saying, hey, so when my company's going MDM, does that mean that, I'm giving up privacy to my company? That's not true, right? Um,
So that's a really good point. In fact, we built a whole product from the ground up just to preserve privacy, and address some of these concerns, frankly, for BYOD users. But even in a corporate phone, IT has control of the mail server, so they don't need the MDM to if they wanted to go read your emails
exactly.
for a subpoena or something, right? So I mean, they can, but they won't. But that you're right. It's there's definitely a balance between privacy, and there is probably two super important things for people to understand from what you just said. One, just to echo that if you enroll a BYOD device into a corporate MDM, you're not giving them the ability to wipe your phone because it's yours. Yes, they control the container, like you said, but they can't really wipe your phone. And that's very important. I mean, there are literally cases where um, IT accidentally wipes someone's phone and deletes all their pictures. And, that's very bad if you're bringing your own phone to work, right? But the other thing is, if you are a corporate phone, if you're issued a corporate phone, again, it's not about spying. It's really just the ability to protect the device. But again, it's just device level protection, right? Not the apps themselves, not what's on the core phone. But certainly, if you are enrolling a BYOD device into at that point, it's MAM as opposed to MDM, right? Mobile app management. So they manage the container. Then you have these two different spaces on your phone. One is your personal side, and one is your corporate side, if you will. And it's different, right? So you're absolutely right. There's definitely capabilities, especially when you're bringing your own device and they enroll it into the MDM without wiping it, then they can't wipe it. And there are
Yeah.
certain things that IT still can't do, even if they wanted to. And you're right, that does come up all the time. We took it a step further, and we created a way to essentially balance privacy and security, because again, remember, we're talking about protecting you from app level threats. So our solution, or part of it, in a BYOD setting, has the advantage of not revealing the list of apps or which apps have which threats to IT, while giving them the ability to essentially put in the security controls, essentially anonymously on the users. So that's another way to balance privacy with some of these systems.
Hmm. No, that's really important for everyone to understand. So let's talk about industry specific. So, I
Yeah.
think, we're all selfish and we have some amazing attendees here from, healthcare, finance, retail, and aviation. So let's go through some examples of where having app level security has supported in industry across some of these critical services to prevent bad things from happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple examples here that I can share, and then we can also just sort of talk through a few other ones. The two examples that come to mind. So banking, right? Banks have regulation, and if it's an international bank, then of course you have regulations, across different regions where the bank is active, and in some cases they have different brands that they operate, but it's really part of the same bank family. So one of the challenges that we hear a lot from big banks is that they basically have all these different extensive regulations, and there's a cost and a time to test these mobile applications. You mentioned earlier, Nim, that sometimes the developers will get the app tested, and then over time it changes. So typically in this industry, you're anytime anyone has a mobile app, you're required to have a pen test, and that pen test takes a few weeks and is essentially a point in time test. And so the banks, when they look at testing their own apps, they can buy a pen test, they can work with a service, they can use services like Quokka to discover vulnerabilities in their own apps. But when they think about the apps that the bank is using, it really depends on which part of the bank, right? The tellers are one threat profile, the management is another threat profile. The loan origination people are different than the commercial banking, et cetera. So essentially, all of these are creating these efforts that take a lot of time to run through and test these things, and they have to provide evidence of compliance, and that's on both sides of the house. So the bank obviously has mobile apps. I love using mobile apps to cash checks and all this convenience, right? But those need to have compliance demonstrated, that they're doing things to protect the end users. But then the bank also has to show that they are securing their mobile fleet and they're not leaking information, which globally, I mean, you could call it PII, but at that point it becomes customer data, user data, et cetera, financial data, of course.
Mm.
So, the use case is developers build these apps, and they need to be able to scan them very frequently, and that's what Quokka provides as part of the benefit. So really, if you are in the financial industry, not even banking, right? We see this in some of the newer online loan folks, or fintech, or virtual credit cards and all that. um, there's just a ton of compliance, and compliance is on both sides of the house, both the dev side and also the user side. And anything that helps you show that you are protecting the mobile apps and the mobile ecosystem will help with those compliance mandates.
In a web application sense, every API call generates a page. That page contains data, and from a compliance regulatory perspective, fintechs and financial companies are expected to, in Canada anyway, for OFSFI, the Office of the Financial Superintendent, demonstrate that integrity testing has been done on that API, on that interactions of that web application. And it is complicated and expensive to do this on an ongoing continuous basis. So they usually do it every major release, and that might be twice a year. So there's a big
Exactly.
gap between what you thought it was doing and what it might actually be doing before you find out again it's not doing what it's supposed to do.
Right. And if you think about it, the level of effort that the bank, or like any bank, will spend some level of effort on securing their own apps. And that includes those pen tests, say, let's say once a quarter or once a year. That includes, automated scanning, et cetera. But do you really think that that same level of effort is applied to all the other apps that the bank employees are using,
Yeah.
right? So that's the big question there. So how do we automate that, right? I mean, there are other products that are on the market that are great at automating pen testing for for laptops, for servers, for websites. Mobile's just different, and so being able to automate this means savings in terms of more testing done more frequently. So you don't have to do this once a half a year or once a year. You can do it every day, and every release of the app, certainly for every app. And it's just that much more protection, and it saves manual pen testers time as well. So that's one. The other example is a government agency. So this is where we really see, I think years ago, about 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years ago, is when we saw a lot of government agencies starting to check the mobile apps, and now it's trickling down into the banking industry, the healthcare industry. I just had a call with a very large healthcare system that's looking to secure around 20,000 devices. And when we dug into where are these devices, some are in patient rooms, some are in the nurse's hands, right? Some are those tablets that you use to schedule conference rooms. I mean, some are in the pediatric ward. So I mean, these devices are not uniform, and so depending on your job function, you need to install different apps, right? The kids have a bunch of, kid-friendly apps in the pediatric wards, whereas the nurses have to install, apps that let them, deal with drug reps and, do dosing lookups and things like that. And the doctors have those apps, and then, maintenance and IT and everything. So, this use case is not just in the government agency. We're starting to see very similar profiles in healthcare, in aviation, a single airline, 100 apps, and maybe really only one that's for the for us, the passengers, and the other 99 is everything from your electronic flight bag for the pilots to crew scheduling to meal prep, right? It's just all these different apps, and so um, protecting them, they all have their own risk profiles. They all have their own level of care and level of updates. They're all made by third parties, where you don't know how much pen testing and other kind of testing and security they do. And so really you have these challenges, right? In this case, it's a large organization out of the United Kingdom, but other times it's a healthcare or an aviation or even banking, where the job functions require different combinations of mobile apps, and that creates a significant blind spot because no one has the human power to go and sit there and test all these apps and not necessarily have the tooling to go. So in this particular, use case, they had a team of 3 full-time people that were basically getting pinged 5 to 8 times per month saying, hey, I need to use this app. And, some other department comes along and says, oh, I have this other app I'd like to use. And they were doing this manual 2 or 3 week exercise for each of these apps. And so by automating that, you know, they were able to reduce it to about 2 hours per week instead of 3 full-time heads.
Yep.
And so that frees up those heads to go back to pen testing web apps, to, ensuring the security of the enterprise servers and lots of other important things. And meanwhile, the mobile ecosystem is protected, and now
Yep.
they're able to review 24 apps a month instead of 5 to 8, and, do more with less.
Yeah.
So those are some specific examples, but I do want to talk about some of these other things that we're seeing. Law firms, um, transportation, logistics companies, gaming companies, they all have their own threat profiles. And actually, I have one other thing I want to share, um, because a lot of times, we're talking about these different risks at different places, and I realized I actually have a slide on this earlier, over here. So this one. Um, so we were at a government event. I think it was in the US. One of my colleagues went and did this presentation on this cam scanner app. This is literally the number one app that comes up on the Apple App Store if you search for PDF creation or PDF scanning. And it has some vulnerabilities, but the really important bits is not even vulnerabilities. It's just things that the app is designed to do. It tells you, I'm going to access your camera, I'm going to access your photos and videos, and I'm going to communicate with some high risk locations. So if you look at the high risk locations, it's predominantly in China. Now, different countries will have their own idea of what a high risk location is, but for us in let's call it North America, right? I mean, in Canada and Mexico and the US, we have some concerns. So if you're a government entity, you have these concerns. Now, if you
Absolutely.
are a manufacturing shop, you probably have similar concerns around IP theft. And if you are a lawyer, you might have some concerns. If you're a journalist, certainly you might have some concerns. So, the concerns are different for different people. The other important thing here is this accesses photos and videos. That doesn't just mean it takes a picture and it can only get to that one picture. It means that you just gave it access to your entire whatever pictures you have on your device. And you can look at what it's doing with those pictures, and you can actually see that it's sending them to servers in China, along with things like your ID, your device ID, your personal information. But again, I'm not saying this app is malicious. I'm saying we are using an app that tells you right in the user terms, it tells you, I'm going to take all your pictures and send them to places. And we're allowing it to do that. And so in this presentation, my colleague says that, I think it was maybe a colonel, um, don't remember the rank exactly, but he basically stood up and said, "I use this app every day. Are you saying that, my my loan application is on
Yeah,
its way to?" Yeah. And it's not because the app stole it. It tells you right in the user terms, I'm going to do
you
this.
agreed to it.
Yeah, exactly. So, this is the thing that is interesting to me about mobile. We don't think of this on our computer. We're basically protecting our hard drive and just don't want people to get full access to everything in the database. But on a mobile phone, just because you gave it permission to take pictures for the purpose of creating a PDF, did you realize it was going to do that? And again, I go back to the DeepSeek example. Everybody's freaking out, but the bottom line is that app is designed to take whatever you type and send it to a server in China. Like it tells you that's what I'm doing.
It
That's where the
clearly
AI
says that.
server is.
Yeah. And it also tells you
So
if anybody bothers reading the end user licensing agreement and the details, it's tracking your location, your device IMEI, activities on your phone, other conversations, and you are authorizing them to do it. So
yeah,
when you consent
yeah,
to it, and so this is a good point to talk about. You don't need one brush to paint security at
yes,
organizations 100% of the time. Like it doesn't have to be one solution. But when you take a risk-based approach, you start to look at the threat plane and say, well, who are my high risk targets in the company? Who are the high value targets? And you know, standard MDM could apply to, call center worker and shipping dock employee and, administrative staff. But when you're talking about the CEO, the CIO, the head of IT or whatnot, these are people that might have access to privileged information on their device. So for those individuals, a second layer of mobile device security that says, hey, let's actually go through and make sure that the apps they're using are sanctioned apps that we approve, and we have vetted the behavior of those applications. Another similar application to this, I was going to use an example, Ilya, was TurboScan. TurboScan is a scanning application, takes 3 pictures, makes a beautiful black and white PDF, but it tells you openly that it's actually sharing everything on your phone. And you don't want a CEO or a chief risk officer, a chief finance officer walking around with this application. They're using it personally to capture receipts when they travel so they can upload them quickly to the expense management system. But that innocent act actually opened up the company and it's sharing data and they consented to it, right? Um,
exactly, exactly. So you're absolutely right. Risk is not the same, and that's been kind of the message of this whole, last 45 minutes is the threat profile is different depending on where you are in the organization and what kind of organization you are. But the risks are they're unique, but they're actually the same, right? If you granted access to your pictures, then you just granted it access to your pictures. You don't know which ones it's taking.
that's right. That's right. Um, Great time for a quick time check. I know we've got 15 minutes left. Um, Folks, if you want to ask any questions, now is probably a good time to hammer them into the Q&A. We're going to jump into talking a little bit about Quokka's Q Scout and what exactly it does and how it can help some of us when we're faced with this challenge of saying, hey, we've got some important people here. We need to double click on an extra layer of security when it comes to securing the device. What can we do?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me share this visual so we could talk about it. The We talked about a couple technologies, mobile device management on the left-hand side, right? Great for corporate controls, great for the device management, distributing applications, data isolation. So that's kind of the standard system that enterprises use. And then there's also MTD. MTD is a mobile threat defense, like an antivirus for your phone, protects you from phishing. It identifies known bad apps, or some known vulnerabilities, right? And potentially, if you let it, it will look at your network. Although the file system monitoring at this point, Apple pretty much doesn't allow third-party apps to do that, so that's getting less and less useful, I think. On an Apple device, an MTD is, it just doesn't have permission to do the deep monitoring of your network and file system the way I think it used to. But certainly, there is some privacy. That's where the privacy intrusion layer kind of comes in, right? If it's actually monitoring everything on your device, trying to identify in real time that you just got hacked, if you will. But we put QScout in the middle of all that, right? So QScout talks to the MDM. It essentially identifies all the apps that are installed on a mobile fleet, and then it does the three things we talked about this whole presentation, right? One is zero-day discovery. So a known bad app is one thing, but discovering that an app turns out to be malicious when no one knows that is really what a zero day is all about, right? It's risks that the in this case the maker of the app is not even aware of, or maybe they are, but it's intentionally malicious, right? So that's one thing we talked about. The other one is the proactive security, right? The idea that a system that sits there and monitors your network, at best, if it recognizes that you're being attacked, it'll say, "Hey, you got attacked 2 minutes ago. I just figured that out." But proactive security means looking at the apps on your phone and understanding what risks they pose to you before they even happen, right? Do you really want to go and take all the pictures of all the receipts, but also, corporate contracts and other sensitive information, and then find out that they leaked over the network? Or do you want to be told that, hey, this app is going to leak whatever you give it, so don't give it things? That's the difference between proactive versus, reactive. And the application security is, it's part of the zero day. It's part of ensuring that the device is safe for you to use. And so QScout is something that we can deploy agentless, which means you don't need to install an app on your phone if you have an MDM. And that's very nice, by the way. That's one of the big selling points is, deploying apps to mobile devices is a pain. And if users have to interact and activate it and do things to it, that's not ideal. So with an MDM, QScout will sit next to it and basically provide you with that zero-day discovery and proactive
Mm.
security without users having to do anything. And that's the government example I provided a little bit ago. That's what they really like about it, is the fact that they can vet these apps without bothering the users. And that works for the apps that are already installed on the device. It works for the updates to those apps, as well as an app that maybe they're considering adding to the set of apps that people can download in that
So this is
organization.
this is agentless. There's no
Yes,
deployment involved. It's not intrusive
yes.
to the end user. You don't have to explain to people and do change management and all this other stuff.
Yeah. And the other thing that that this product really addresses is what you mentioned earlier, Nim, about the different brushes, right? So when you roll out this app intelligence to an organization, you don't have to set it up to, always on, always off. You could actually differentiate. Once you integrate with the MDM, you don't need the device agent, so that's great. You can provide that actionable security and privacy insights, but you can create policies and alerts based on risk. And that means, exactly what you said about a CEO versus somebody in the loading docks, or somebody that's a teller at a bank versus the VP, somebody that's doing contracts. It's an attorney versus, the IT person at the firm. So you can create these different policies, and then the alerting is based on that risk profile. So that is really what allows it to demonstrate an ROI. And we talked about the ROI being, you can vet more applications more quickly using less resources, so you can redistribute those folks. It also means that this is not a system that generates hundreds and hundreds of alerts or even thousands. Some of these things are creating 1,000 alerts of possible problems that someone then has to look at one by one and decide if they're actually an issue or not. Now, this system generates very few alerts because it has all that contextual intelligence on what the apps are capable of doing and what the risk profiles are per
Mm-hmm.
individual. And ultimately, it allows you to comply with those security and privacy mandates. And we talked about that in the banking world and in healthcare. There's, their own compliance issues, aviation, regulated industries, and certainly governments. So that's um, that's what we're really offering with this QScout product. Doesn't require an agent, easy to deploy, doesn't generate a ton of noise, and you can customize it based on those different risk profiles depending on where
Mm-hmm.
the individuals are.
And it'll guarantee some interesting, difficult conversations with senior executives to say why they can't have that app on their phone.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
we've got
But
some good
but the data will
questions.
be there.
Yeah, but exactly. We've got some good questions. The first one coming in here is iOS is rock solid on security. Do we really need more than what Apple provides?
That's a good question. So I think it was a week ago, yet another article dropped that, hey, there's malware identified in the Apple App Store as well as
Yeah.
Google, which is stealing pictures, applying machine learning on them, and anything in there that's like a crypto wallet key is then getting used by the malicious actors in this case. We've
Hmm.
seen VPN apps that sneak through. So the article really makes a point that, hey, this really snuck through Apple's controls. If you look on an annual basis, how many apps did Apple pull from the store because somebody told them that they were malicious? It's not a huge number, but it's hundreds.
Yeah.
So, and so yes, Apple, it does have a good reputation for security. Yes, Apple does have this whole sort of security through obscurity where no one has access to, most of their source. No one can really look at it. So, they do a good job of protecting us. But the Apple App Store is not incentivized to block apps. It's incentivized to give you apps so they can make money on it, right? And what we see is they do a great job of blocking the stuff that's like blatantly malicious, that matches the signatures, that does this, but it's not perfect, and that's sort of by design and sort of by the reality. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Europe is forcing Apple to allow third-party app stores. Other countries, I'm sure, will follow. So then you're really losing on that security. I mean, I think we're kind of frankly complacent. People are just used to the idea that Apple is safe. That cam scanner example was on Apple. There's other apps. You mentioned your scanner app, Nim. That was on
Hmm.
Apple. So, sure, Android gets a bad rap for security, but that whole many eyeballs theory is why Android is also patching a lot more often,
Hmm.
right? Whereas Apple, no one knows about it, but if somebody exploits it, they could do that for 3 years, as was the
Hmm.
case with the there was a couple patches a couple of years ago where they were patching things that have been present for about 3 years that it wasn't Celebrite, it was one of the other ones that were using it. So long story short, what we see day to day when we look at iOS apps is we see that the majority of them are fine, but we do see maliciousness on the App Store. And the other thing I mentioned about MTDs not really being able to do much on the device, and that's just Apple's strategy, right? They don't want other companies to have that deep access to the device. And so some of the traditional, network capture and some of the other mechanisms that have been used to provide security on the device are going further and further away and not really producing much. So the risks are now more predominantly coming from the apps themselves. And that's where I think the iOS, rock solid, sure, but not perfect. So the
Mm.
risks are there.
Another question is if a company does not have an MDM, such as Intune and whatnot, but decides to go with a Qscope platform, how do we know if a device is jailbroken or deviated from the manufacturer's recommended operating system?
Yeah, so QScout, in a BYOD scenario where there is no MDM, we do have an app that goes on the device. So in that case, it is an agent that you deploy, and that app then will tell the IT admins So it's a privacy first approach. So essentially, IT can set a policy that tells the user, hey, you can't have your device jailbroken. And IT doesn't necessarily know which user's device is
Mhm.
jailbroken, but the user will be notified that you are out of corporate compliance, and IT will see that, device is eventually gets resolved to zero, or they can notify the staff that, you guys need to, whichever one of you has that rooted device, we know, and
Yeah.
yeah, get it fixed. So things like rooted devices, devices that have developer mode on, or devices that are out of date with their patches. These are things that QScout can surface. And again, it's policy driven, right? So depending on who the individuals are, you can essentially control whether they get that notification or not. But IT can see across the whole fleet how many devices do I have out of compliance, and then they can
Yeah.
take action on that.
Absolutely. No, that's very cool. There are no other questions from anyone in the room. Um, if you do have questions and you want to ask, feel free to send us a quick note. But let me just summarize. So a couple key takeaways, right? So risk-based approach. It doesn't have to be the same for everyone. Understand who needs layers of protection and how can you go inch towards that destination of zero trust. Um, Understanding that MDM is not an oversight tool or an overwatch tool, it really is a uh, visibility and transparency tool that allows you to see what's happening and what's going to happen and how you can mitigate it before risks become issues. And let's make sure that we keep the dialogue open in terms of uh, supporting people through understanding why it's important to have sanctioned and unsanctioned applications within your organization. If you take anything away, really rationalize the impact of installing certain applications on your phone. And then the last point, with the advent of AI, there's tons of AI applications available in the marketplace. Everyone is trying to use a GPT-J or GPT-based platform to create their own AI-based tools.
Yep.
These applications, because they follow best practices, do make themselves into the marketplaces for Google Play as well as Apple iStore. But that doesn't mean they're safe just because they're there. They're there because they've been built and created to a certain standard. And you can accept, by downloading that application, the chance to share and leak data to these tools. And having visibility on what AI is being used in your company is going to be very imperative to protect your information going forward. And you need tools to be able to do that. You can't very easily identify them if you don't have an MDM, if you don't have listening posts on the devices or agents that are paying attention to what end users are doing with their phones. With that, guys, thank you so much, Ilya, for joining me today in another
Thanks for having me.
Inside the Matrix webinar. Um, Thank you, everybody who came today. Hopefully, we have been able to share a little bit of insight and not to freak you out. Don't put your phones in your microwaves and shut them, but learn to adopt them and use them safely.
Yep.
So thank you all for joining us. And until next time, see you later.